Lean in, closer. The fire doesn't have much wood left tonight. And the frost doesn't care about our comfort. It crawls across the window pane like glass spiders, freezing the world outside into absolute stillness. You look at the ground beneath your boots, and you think it's dead. You think it's just dirt, clay, stone. A quiet platform built to support our houses, our roads, our graves. You think it's a floor. You're wrong. It's a ceiling. And whatever is living directly under it has been listening to our footsteps for a very long time, waiting for the right season to breathe. What follows isn't a simple village record or a standard history lesson. It is a reconstruction, a grim mosaic pieced together from surviving folklore, fragments of old Mediterranean herbals, and the cold, hard chemistry we finally understand today. It is a map of a collective madness. The old accounts point to the winter of 1642, not in the flat fields of England, where the root never truly took hold, but in an isolated, shadow-choked valley in the northern Apennines, a place where the soil was heavy, damp, and thick with the secrets of old monastic gardens. The winter that year was unusual for the mountains. It wasn't the clean, biting cold that freezes the earth into a protective iron shield. It was a wet, heavy, rotting winter. The sky hung low and belly gray for 3 months, turning the terraced slopes into a thick, black porridge that never dried. The air smelled wrong that November. It wasn't the clean, crisp scent of coming snow. It was a sweet, heavy, cloying stench that clung to the wool of your cloak, like apples rotting inside a closed cellar, or old teeth. The livestock knew it first. Animals have a boundary line in their heads, a wire that snaps when the air turns sour. The oxen refused to turn the southern furrows, their iron shoes sinking into the mire. They stood at the edge of the tree line for days, their eyes rolled back until the yellowed whites showed, their chests heaving rhythmically in the gray fog. Then the birds left. It wasn't a standard migration. It was too late in the year for that, and too frantic. One morning, the bare branches of the chestnut trees were heavy with thousands of crows, sitting in total, unnatural silence. By noon, they rose as a single black sheet, tearing their throats open with panicked shrieks as they fled toward the coast. The silence they left behind was heavy enough to make your teeth ache. That's how the ground prepares you. It strips away the noise of the world, one layer at a time, until you have nothing left to listen to but the dirt beneath your heels. The local fragments call the site Il Fosso delle Mandragole, the Mandrake Pits. The folklore enthusiasts love to talk about the myth. They write books about the root that grows beneath the gallows, shaped like a twisted, screaming little man. They tell you it screams when you pull it from the dark. They tell you the sound is so sharp, so unnatural, that it shatters the heart of anyone who hears it. Which is why the old texts tell you to tie a starving dog to the stem
run for the hills. That's a bedtime story. A clever fairy tale designed to keep curious children from wandering into the deep ravines where the ground is unstable. The truth written in the margins of a dead physician's ledger is far more clinical and far, far worse. There were 5 farmers who broke the ground in that valley during the deep winter. Hard men, the kind of men with black dirt permanently wedged under their fingernails and skin that looked like cured tallow. They weren't superstitious. They didn't have the luxury of fear. The autumn wheat crop had failed, and the village was staring down the throat of a lean January. They needed to clear the low meadow, a 3-acre patch of bottomland that had once been an old abbey garden, left abandoned since the plague years of the previous century. They took their heavy iron spades to the soil just after the morning bell. The fog was so thick it swallowed their lanterns, reducing the world to a circle of damp gray 5 feet wide. The first 3 feet of digging were normal, just the usual muscle ache of winter labor, clearing the dead gorse and the matted grass. But then, around mid-morning, the spades hit the layer.
It wasn't rock. It didn't ring against the iron blades. It felt soft, yielding, and strangely elastic, like cutting through a mattress stuffed with horsehair or the thigh of an old carcass left in a ditch. When the men pulled their spades back out of the dark trench, the iron wasn't wet with groundwater. The blades were coated in a thick, milky, yellow-white sap. It didn't flow like water. It sat on the metal, bubbling and frothing as it reacted with the cold air. It wasn't the sight that broke their focus first. It was the taste. A sudden sharp prickle in the back of the throat, like breathing in crushed mustard seeds and old vinegar, turning the saliva in their mouths bitter and dry as ash.
Thomas, the eldest of the brothers, didn't stop his work. He was a stubborn man, the kind who viewed an obstacle as a personal insult from the earth itself. He reached down into the trench with his bare hands, his fingers slick with the yellow milk, wanting to tear out whatever was choking his plowshare. He described it later, in his brief moments of clarity, as a web. A massive, interconnected carpet of pale, fleshy roots stretching out for miles beneath the valley floor. They weren't just sitting inertly in the clay. They were moving.
It was a rhythmic, microscopic pulse. Thousands of miles of subterranean fiber expanding and contracting in the dark, pushing that yellow milk through the veins of the valley. By noon, the 5 men stopped digging. Not because their arms were tired, and not because the work was done. It was the pressure. It started behind their eyes. A tight, hot, throbbing ache right between the brows, like an iron nail being tapped into the skull with a small wooden mallet. Then came the change in their mouths. A heavy, metallic copper tang on the back of the tongue. The unmistakable taste of a rusted coin held under the lip.
They thought it was the wind coming off the mountain. They thought it was the vapor from the rotting peat. But when Thomas turned to look at his brother, he noticed the man's ears were wet. It wasn't sweat, and it wasn't rain. A thin, clear, odorless fluid was leaking from his ear canals, running in pale streaks down the grime of his jawline. And then the earth began to sing. It didn't start as a scream. The old documents don't use that word. They call it the Great Hum. Imagine a 1,000-strong choir trying to hold a single low note through closed lips. A vibration
forward like water through a broken stone dam. But the farmers didn't hear it from the pits. They heard it inside their own heads, behind the ear bone. Every man heard his own name being called, shouted, whispered. But the voices belonged to people who were already under the grass. Thomas heard his mother, 3 years buried in the churchyard, begging him to dig her up because the winter water was getting into her eyes. His brother heard his daughter, the one the smallpox took when she was 4, crying because she couldn't find her shoes in the dark.
The 17th century accounts blame the devil. They speak of witchcraft, of an opening of the mouth of hell. But the modern analysis of the botany tells a story that is much colder. It was the Mandragora officinarum, a massive ancient colony of it that had grown undisturbed for a century beneath the old monastic pasture. The unusual waterlogged winter had caused the giant root systems to rot while still alive, creating a subterranean fermentation process. The roots became a natural distillery, producing a highly concentrated volatile vapor of tropane alkaloids, scopolamine, hyoscyamine, and atropine. When the men's spades broke the skin of those ancient roots, they didn't just release sap. They released a dense, heavy gas that hung low in the fog trapped in the trench. The 5 farmers weren't hearing ghosts. They were breathing in a localized atmospheric poison. A mass auditory hallucination of the highest order. A chemically induced madness that locked onto the acoustic nerves, overstimulated the temporal lobes, and turned the brain's internal static into a vivid, waking nightmare. But try telling that to a man whose mind is tearing itself to pieces from the inside out. By nightfall, the meadow had become a scene of absolute quiet horror. The men weren't fighting each other. There was no anger in them. They were simply trying to get the voices out of their houses. Thomas had taken his short pruning knife, the one he used for the vines, and had driven it deep into his own ear canal, searching for the small, dead voice that wouldn't stop complaining about the damp. The leather of his boots made a rhythmic slithering sound through the black mud as his body convulsed, the iron blade clicking against his jawbone with every tremor. When the village watch finally came out with their long poles and lanterns the next morning, the 5 men were sitting in a neat circle in the center of the plowed mud. They weren't screaming anymore. Their ears were gone, replaced by ragged, blackened holes where they had used sticks, stones, and knives to silence the choir. They were staring down into the pit, the white, stringy fibers of the root wedged between their teeth. They weren't eating. They were just holding the flesh of the plant against their lips, as if trying to suck the silence out of the wood. The pits were filled in with lime and stone by order of the local court. The valley was abandoned within 2 years. The people simply packed what they could carry and left the soil to the weeds. The records were removed to a secure archive, locked away from public view, filed under the simple heading of an unusual pestilence of the mind. We think we're safe now because we have the words. We think because we can say scopolamine, because we can write atropine, because we understand psychotropic toxicity, that the horror has been neutralized. We think science is a wall that keeps the dark from leaking through. But names don't change the nature of the soil. The roots are still down there. Not just in old European valleys, not just in forgotten herbals. An interconnected web of living, breathing undeveloped lot after a long week of rain, and you notice the air smells just a bit too sweet, just a bit too much like rotting fruit. Don't look down at your boots. And whatever you do, if you feel a slight vibration in your shins, don't listen to the hum